Hi FE farmers. So this week I'm delivering your home garden kits to you. And as a reminder, if you still want one, you can still get one, but you do need to fill out the form which you find in Canvas. That way I just make sure that all the materials are getting used and I'm not bringing you a bunch of stuff you don't actually want. So let's go ahead and get started. The objective of this lesson is to show you how to get started with your kit. And that's going to include three things: how to set up your pots and where to locate them, how to make sure this habitat is set up so your plants can succeed, and then how to figure out how to actually transplant your starts into the pots and put in some seeds as well.
So one of the first things to figure out is where you're going to put your garden and put your pots. So there's 4 considerations here. The first and probably most important is, if possible, you want your whole garden to get full sun, meaning it's not shaded or obstructed by anything like a tree, or maybe you have like a patio awning or something that keeps sunlight from getting to the plants. Now, if you do have an obstruction, it's not the end of the world. You ideally want a place where these plants can get 12 hours of sunlight a day. So if you think about at the like right now in May, we get about 14 hours of sunlight. You want those plants should only be in the shade for hopefully about 2 hours a day when the sun is up, that is. So the best place is often a south-facing patio or window. So the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and then it sort of travels across the southern reaches of the sky. So if you just look up in the middle of the day, you can kind of see where the sun is. But if your location faces to the south, then you're probably going to get full sun. Another important consideration is that your garden is accessible. You don't want it in a place you don't visit often, because your plants will need watering daily and frequent monitoring. So you don't want to, say, put it at like your friend's house that might have a better sun location, because you just can't take care of them as easily because they're not near you. Finally, a fun consideration to think about is whether you can put your garden in a place where there's a heat sink. So you'll notice in this picture, I have my little demo garden up against a wall on my house. So this wall is going to reflect a lot of heat and sunlight. That's going to keep the plants warmer, which means they are going to actually grow faster. If I had, so another type of heat sink would be putting your pots on concrete. That's going to suck in more heat. Just think about like when we talked about the greenhouse effect and the albedo effect. So concrete and black surfaces absorb sunlight, so they are going to hold a lot of heat and keep those plants extra warm, meaning they are going to grow a little bit more quickly.
So now that we have our pots watered in, we can start talking about how to plan out your transplants. So you'll notice we have plants of various sizes here. Like this tomato is going to take up a lot more space than this little cilantro here. So I want us to think about these pots as little mini tiny garden beds. So just like we have beds on the farm, we could put maybe just one plant in this space, or we could choose to put multiple plants in this space. And this largely depends on their root system. So the root system of a tomato is going to spread out really, really big and really probably get down to the very bottom of these pots. However, these little cilantros here, you could absolutely plant 2 or more of these in the same pot and they aren't going to compete. Remember, plants need access to soil nutrients as well as sunlight. So the objective here is to plant them far enough apart that they can succeed, but also make sure we're maximizing our space and getting our plants as close as we can while they're still able to access the maximum amount of nutrients to succeed. That way we get the most food.
So before we get into plant spacing specific to our little gardens, I want to talk about the categories that are important to think about. So the first thing we want to talk about when planting a garden is how much space these plants take up. So depending on the size of the species, some plants don't need very much space to grow and won't get very big, and some plants are going to take up that whole pot and even more. So we're going to sort of break things down into categories. So like this first category as an example is greens. The second thing we want to think about is the amount of time it's going to take for these plants to grow, so time in the garden. So for most of these greens, as an example, it's going to take them between 21 and 40 days, so like 3 weeks and 5 weeks, to grow to their full mature size. The next category is harvest window, which refers to how long those vegetables are in prime harvest condition. So if you don't harvest a lettuce soon enough, it can start to taste a little bit bitter, and eventually it will make a flour, which makes the leaves very bitter, although very nutritious also. For some plants, you can have multiple harvests, up to 3 usually. So for instance, with our lettuce that I gave you, which is the Salanova variety, you can cut that 3 times every other week. And so that'll give you sort of 3 separate harvest dates for that lettuce. And finally, for successions, what this refers to is if you wanted, say, if you would just love lettuce so much and you wanted lettuce all the time, you could just start lettuce every 2 weeks in your pots, and that would give you like a constant supply of lettuce to harvest. So when like the first pot of lettuce is done, you could plant new lettuce in there, and you could just keep having abundant lettuce all throughout the year. So now that I've covered the categories for these greens specifically, for space, they typically are going to take between 2 inches and a foot. So what I recommend is that you put about 4, like 3 to 4. Ooh, whoa, wow, that's really lovely. You put 3 to 4 plants in one of those fabric pots I've given you. Next, we have Asian vegetables, which is a really silly category, but most of these are Brassica rapa species. So we have things like bok choy, tatsoi, choysum, hansaitai, komatsuna, and there's thousands and thousands of these vegetables, and they're all really awesome. So I did not give you any of these in your kit. We didn't have any quite ready to go yet. But if you were to want to plant some of these, like get your own seeds, I recommend putting them 6 to 18 inches apart. So you could probably do 1 to 2 in your pot. That would be ideal. Root vegetables, I did give you some beet seed. We didn't have really any extra carrot seed, unfortunately. But for these beets, you will want to plant. You could probably fit 5. Wow, drawing with this thing is a little tricky. You could fit 5 in one pot. So that's quite a bit of beet, which is pretty awesome. That's a couple meals worth of beets there. Now I gave you some radishes and some turnip seed. And these are really, really great quick vegetables. Radishes planted in those pots will probably only take 3 weeks till they're ready to eat, which is really quite fast. And you can plant them as close as 1 inch apart, which is kind of amazing. So I'll show you another picture of how you might seed the radishes, and that's I show that in the video as well. But you can probably plant like 24 plus seeds, individual seeds in the pot at the time, and they're all going to succeed and do great. Bunch greens. So I've given you a kale start, a collard start, and a chard start. These are great vegetables because they are continuously harvested. So what we do, and what you might remember from harvesting on the farm, is you pick off the lower leaves of a kale or collard or chard plant, and more leaves grow. So this is great bang for your buck if you just want some greens to eat every single week and have these plants just keep going and going and going. So they do get fairly big, as you might remember. So you want to plant 1 to 2, probably just 1 plant per pot, and that's going to be give them sort of the best habitat for success. I did give you a sprouting broccoli as well, which would do well in these pots. So sprouting broccolis are going to make these little florets like this, and you can sort of just break them off and throw them in a stir fry or something really tasty. So this is kind of what our purple sprouting broccoli is, and you might remember our Happy Rich broccoli from the fall also is sort of the same variety here. So these you're definitely going to just put one right in the middle. These plants get very, very big, and they do take a longer time to grow, but you often can get a pretty long harvest out of these things, 2 to 4 weeks. So everybody loves tomatoes. Well, I guess not everybody loves tomatoes, but tomatoes are great. I've given you 2 varieties, a blush cherry tomato, which is sort of a larger orange and yellow cherry. It's one of my favorites, super, super tasty. And then a black Krim slicing tomato, which is native to the Czech Republic. So it's a similar temperature to ours. That's where this plant was bred initially. So these you're definitely going to only put one per pot. They're going to get very, very big and might need a stake or some other support over time. And although they do take a long time, they'll probably take 60 to 80 days from them to start actually producing fruit. You will be able to keep harvesting from that plant until the frost hits in October. So with a healthy tomato plant, you can get, 4 to 6 tomatoes, cherry tomatoes a week, and like 1 to 2 slicers a week for about 10 weeks, which is really pretty awesome. So they're a good bang for their buck. I did also give you a cucumber. So cucumbers, you're definitely going to do one per pot. And I want to note that these cucumbers are going to spread like a vine. So they will crawl out of the pot and go all over the place, which is kind of fun. But they are also what we call indeterminate. So when they have multiple harvests, you can just, again, get 1 to 2 cucumbers a week till the frost. So another sort of 10-week harvest vegetable. With summer squash, I did give you a summer squash here. I sort of misnamed this slide, so I apologize. A golden glory yellow zucchini, which is a really, really tasty zucchini. It is yellow, not green, but it eats just the same. 1 per pot here. It will also get really big and bushy, so you might need to give that pot a little bit more space. I did not give you any winter squash or melons, but if you wanted to grow a pumpkin and you had a pumpkin seed, same thing, 1 per pot. It's going to vine like the cucumbers and kind of go all over the place, which is pretty fun. And you will probably get 2 or 3 pumpkins off that plant. I did not give you any alliums, so onions, shallots, and garlic, because they are just very time consuming to grow. But if you really want to grow some onions, you could plant seeds directly 4 inches apart. So you could fit, let's see, I'm just doing a little math in my head here. You could probably fit, 12 onions in 1 pot, which is pretty decent. It's like a nice bag of onions there. So here are some pictures of how I arrange plants in my little pot. So you notice for these lettuce, I gave them about 4 to 6 inches. I wanted these ones to get a little bit bigger, so I put them sort of in this triangle pattern, this equidistant apart from each other. That's going to make sure they all have equal space to grow and have lots of soil nutrients. With the cilantro, they can go a little bit closer together. So I put 4 of them in 1 pot, and these are about 4 inches apart. So notice how I am always spacing things equidistant apart. With the tomato, as I mentioned, even though it's kind of small at this point, you're just doing 1 right in the middle. You might be able to like squeeze some radishes around there and harvest them before the tomato gets really, really big to maximize your space. So you could say, put some radish seeds like this around. That's what we call companion planting. And you'd get some good radishes from that as well. But the tomato is quickly going to take over in probably 4 weeks. Same thing with summer squash. I wouldn't recommend trying to companion plant anything because this squash is going to get giant very quickly. But you'll also be eating squash in a couple weeks. So yeah, just 1 per pot there. So with the basil here, you could probably plant 3, but I chose to put 2 in this pot. They're about 6 inches apart. These plants will get pretty big and they will branch off. I'll make sort of future videos of how to harvest those correctly. Broccoli, although these starts are tiny, 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 1 per pot. They are going to get huge very quickly. For the cucumber, same thing, small start, but going to get big very quickly. Definitely 1 per pot right in the middle. So noticing a trend here with the chard, another 1 per pot. We want to make sure it's right in the middle so those roots can spread out all around and have lots of space to grow. So finally, with direct seeding, so for things like the radishes, turnips, and the spring mix, these are seeds you can put pretty close together. And I sort of show you a demo of this, but just to sort of define what I'm talking about. If I were to plant some radishes in this pot here, what I could choose to do is put seeds about every 2 inches, and then 2 inches apart, put some more. So I have these sort of little rows of plants, just like we have on the farm. And although these feel really tight together, they are going to grow just fine and grow really quickly. So don't be afraid to pack some of those smaller seeded stuff, radishes, turnips, spring mix. Those are going to do really well close together and give you a lot of good food.
So one of the first things you want to do before you plant is make sure your pots are really, really well watered. The reason you want to do this is even if your plant starts are moist, but your soil is dry, water always moves to dry places. So any moisture in the soil of the transplants is going to get sucked out into the larger pot, and that's going to give them a really tough start to their life. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to get this soil completely wet before we continue. So I've got my big garden hose here, and I'm going to use that, but I'm also going to show you how to make your own little watering can. But I'm just going to go ahead and give this a ton of water in sort of little blasts. But we want this soil to be completely soaked through. So when your soil is ready to plant, it should be really pretty wet, very, very moist. You should be able to take your pointer finger and go as about as deep as you can and still feel that water. At that point, you're going to be ready to plant. So if you don't have a hose with a watering head, hoses are often a little too aggressive for watering a small garden. So what you can do, you may remember this container from my last video, you can turn a container like this into a watering can really easily. Here's how. We're just going to drill about 6 to 8 holes in the top, and then 1 hole over here to make sure that it doesn't get sort of back pressure and do that sort of glooping motion. So here we go. All right, so here we have 1 finished watering can. Alright, so now that we understand the sort of different planting patterns and the amount of habitat each of these species needs, I'm just going to demonstrate some transplanting for you. So let's say we're going to take some of our smaller plants, we're going to take our lettuces and our cilantros. So I have 2 lettuce and 2 cilantro, and believe it or not, these can all fit in 1 pot. So what the planting pattern I'm going to use, I'm going to choose to put these lettuces in the corner, and then the cilantro is over here. So I'm giving the lettuces about 4 to 6 inches, and the cilantro 4 to 6 inches. So they're all uniformly spaced throughout the pot. That'll make sure the plants have enough space to sort of spread out. So to actually plant these, all I want to do is I can take 3 fingers, and again, if you haven't watered your pots in first, make sure you do that. It should be a really moist habitat right now. You're just going to make a little divot, stick the plant in, cover it up, and gently press. It is that easy. So I'll just go ahead and do that. So what we're looking for here now that these are planted is our blocks are completely buried, and we've got a nice contact between those soil blocks and the surrounding potting soil. That way the roots are going to be able to make a seamless transition from those blocks into the surrounding soil and be really, really happy. Don't worry even if you get your leaves buried just a little bit, because they will, after they get watered, they're going to turn right around and just pop right back out of the soil. So now that we've got these transplanted, it is good to give them a little more water to make sure they're all nice and settled. All right, this pot is done. All right, let's take a look at planting something a little bit larger, like this blush tomato. So to plant this, what we're gonna do, we'll notice there's actually this funny little J-curve in here. And what's cool with tomatoes is all of these little root hairs, or all these little hairs on the stem, can actually become roots. So it's okay to bury these plants a little bit deeper than other species. So for a larger plant that's gonna take up the whole pot, we wanna make sure we're planting this right in the middle so the plants can spread uniformly. But the same rules apply. We just wanna make sure the blocks are buried completely, and that there's at least like a 1/4 inch of soil between the block and the top of the potting mix. So again, I've pre-watered this. I'm going to have to make a much bigger hole and get some of this potting soil out of the way. And I am just going to bury this a little bit deeper, and we'll see some root growth. So notice I'm giving it a nice firm press to make sure it's standing upright. So that's it. It's that easy. Once again, I'll give it a little bit of water, and we're good to go. All right, so let's talk about direct seeding. So direct seeding is where you're taking seeds, of course, and planting them directly into the soil instead of transplanting them after starting them inside. So there are a couple basic rules with direct seeding which make direct seeding anything really easy. There's 2 things to consider. You want to make sure you're planting things at the right depth and giving them enough water. So a bean seed here, I'm going to plant some green beans. These are going to get really, really large, and sometimes you can know that because the seeds themselves are pretty big. So when we're planting, we want to make sure any seed, no matter how big or how small, is buried at least sort of half as deep as it is big. So the way to sort of think about this is this seed is about a ½ inch long, so we want to bury it at least a ¼ inch deep. Now, if you remember from sort of the planting guidelines we just went over, this plant is going to get really, really big. So we only actually want one plant total in this pot. But to make sure we get one, sometimes seeds don't always germinate. They don't always start their life. We're going to plant 2 seeds in the same hole, and then what you're going to do later is just kill the weaker one, which I know is kind of brutal, but that's gardening life for you. So what I'm going to do is just use my finger to make a little indent in the soil. And I'm going to drop these seeds in there, making sure they're not too deep. Cover and press. And then give them a little water. And now they're off and ready to go. Now I'm going to show you kind of a different way to direct seed. So maybe you're a big fan of like baby greens and lettuce mix. So I've included as part of your kit this packet of spring mix. So this is different little baby mustards. So it's going to be sort of a slightly spicy greens mix that makes a really good salad. So these are plants that we actually want to grow really close together because you harvest them repeatedly. They're called cut and come back greens at a really small size. So for something like this, what you'd want to do is we're going to actually make some little lines in the pot. And I'm putting these about 2 inches apart from each other. And then the tip I'm going to give you is to take your packet and fold it a little bit like that, so you got a little envelope. And then you're just going to gently tap until seeds start coming out. And they're going to be really, really dense. But those are going to make a nice little forest of little baby greens. So after you're done with that, you're just going to gently cover these up. And these seeds are small, so we don't want to bury them very deep. And then give a nice press. And then again, water. Always water. Hopefully this has given you everything you need to get started with your garden. We've covered watering in, transplanting, and direct seeding. Look for another video next week as our plants start to germinate and come up. Have fun!